we will be Jaguars way last fall.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I was so mesmerized by it that I went knocking on his door. He said, "Do you have a book available? I'm on Kindle." He said, "No, Amazon." So this is introducing Mitch Anderson. He is an environmental justice activist, and he's done so much good with Nemonte. They have saved 500,000 acres in the Ecuadorian forest. When you read the book, it's just stunning for the second time. Yeah. Chapter 16 is really dynamite. So his foundation is in San Francisco on Bush Street. I know that well. And Etta, you want to tell what you're doing with your artwork and support?
Oh, yeah. If anybody's interested, particularly in one painting, I would donate 30% to the organization. So I would maybe
Yeah, so the artwork, anything she has to sell. So,
The bag, Vernon.
what?
Sally, the bag that I gave you, pass it around.
Well, wait, let's wait until he talks.
Okay, but I don't want you to forget.
I won't, I guess so. Okay, so let's support what they're doing with the Amazon. We were in Brazil for 3 years. I wanted so badly to get to the Amazon. It was being decimated, and we've been reading about the fires and the oils and what they're doing, the lumber, the rubber, just decimating the people. This guy found a gal who was really angry at the oil company for coming in, polluting the waters, their livelihood, the fish. The children were dying because of being in the water. So, Mitch.
Thank you.
Mitch Anderson.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much, Raquel. Thank you, Judith. Thank you, Etta, for opening up your home. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We should have done this a long time ago.
Yes.
We should have done this a long time ago. And Nemonte should be here right now. She's the star of the show. So thank you for bearing with me and wanting to be here with me. We'll make sure to try to have another space, hopefully in January. We're going to be back. And well, I'll just do a little, I'm going to do a little presentation, maybe do a little reading. And I think really what this should be about is just a conversation and open it up to questions. I guess my first question to start is how many folks here have been able to read the book? Oh, amazing. Okay, cool.
I read two of them.
Oh, that's so wonderful. Okay, well, my name is Mitch Anderson, as Raquel said. Nemonte is, right now she's in the Amazon rainforest. She's in Ecuador with our kids. This is our last week here in San Miguel, so I'm moving out, packing up the house and everything, so this is especially special to be able to have a space like this with y'all. Originally I'm from San Francisco, California, but I've spent the last 20 years of my life outside the United States, living and working with and learning from indigenous peoples. And really my journey started here in Mexico in 2003. I lived with the Mayan people for 4 years, and they changed my life. Really unsheltered me. I grew up in San Francisco and in Marin County, and I was able to see not only my own privilege, but also my own poverty. That I was disconnected from my ancestors, disconnected from the land. I hadn't grown up cultivating food or understanding the connection with nature, and didn't have memories that went more than a generation or two back. And living and working with indigenous peoples changed my life and set me on a course where I met this gal, as Raquel said. Nemonte, this is Nemonte, this is my wife, Nemonte Nenquimo. She's a Warani woman, mother, leader, We met in 2013. We met in chapter 16 of the book. That's why she likes it, because that's the beginning of the love story. And I guess what I'd love to be able to do is share a little bit about why we wrote this book together. Then I'll read a little bit, and then share a little bit more about the state of the Amazon right now, and our work to protect the Amazon, work with indigenous peoples, and then open it up to questions. Does that sound good? Yeah? Okay. So I moved, the first time that I went to the Amazon rainforest was in 2007. And you might find it interesting to know that the first thing that I learned about going to the Amazon wasn't about plant medicines or spirituality or about biodiversity. It wasn't even about indigenous culture. It was about oil. It was about the way the oil companies had been decimating the rivers and the forests and indigenous cultures since the 1960s. And most people, when they think about the Amazon, don't think about oil. Think about deforestation, maybe soy, maybe gold mining, maybe African palm, maybe beef and cattle ranching. But in the upper Amazon, in the area that flows down from the Andes range, which is the western part of the Amazon, it's sitting on top of a massive reserve of oil. So millions of years ago, hundreds of millions of years ago, the entire Amazon River flowed westwards. And when the Andes range rose up, it created this massive inland delta, a huge lagoon, hundreds of millions of years ago. And that lagoon, over millions and millions of years, all of the organic matter pressed down, it became this massive oil reservoir. And so in the 1940s, oil companies from Europe, Shell, began prospecting for oil, and they were eventually forced out by the Waorani people in the 40s. They were speared by the Waorani people, and they left. And then in the 1960s, two American oil companies, Occidental Petroleum in Peru and Chevron, or Texaco, in Ecuador, discovered oil. And that was in the 1960s, huge gushers like you can remember from California or the day in Texas. And over the course of the next, now 60 years, have been exploiting oil across the upper Amazon, drilling hundreds of wells, opening up roads, laying pipelines, and creating massive environmental and public health crisis. For the first 30 years, from the 60s up into the 90s, there was absolutely no environmental regulation whatsoever. The governments, Ecuador, Peru, didn't even have access to the Amazon. They didn't have the resources. The oil companies were the gods. They were the kings. They were the ones that would bring out the government officials in helicopters and show them what they're doing. But there was absolutely no capacity on the part of local governments to control or regulate oil development. And so what the companies did is they chose to produce oil in the cheapest possible fashion. And so they would basically, when you produce oil, you produce crude oil, natural gas, and toxic waters of formation, toxic wastewater. About 60 to 70% of what's produced is toxic wastewater. It's heavily salty, laden with toxic metals, heavy metals, piping hot, and they would just dump all of that into the rivers and streams that indigenous peoples have been relying on for thousands of years. They also created shoddy infrastructure that was prone to spills. So there was oil spills on a regular basis. So over the course of 30 years, the Ecuadorian Amazon and the Peruvian Amazon was transformed by the oil industry. The governments of the region took advantage of the fact that the oil companies were building roads, and so they would helicopter in and plane in farmers from other parts of Ecuador and from Peru to colonize the rest of the forest, similar to the gold rush, saying whatever you cut down is yours. And that was a strategic reason, because each country wanted to be able to colonize the Amazon rainforest and protect their borders, so that they could maintain their borders against foreign invasion, against Peru or Colombia. But what happened is the indigenous peoples, who've been the guardians of this forest for thousands of years, lost their territories, were corralled by not only the oil industry, but then by loggers, by cattle ranchers, by African palm. And it's an absolute miracle that indigenous communities to this day are still speaking their language, are still practicing their cultures, are still protecting their forests in what continues to be the most biodiverse part of the Amazon rainforest. It continues to be a lifeline of biodiversity, of resilience, forest resilience, and it continues to be a carbon sink. So it continues to draw down all of the carbon that we need to keep out of the atmosphere. So when I traveled in 2007 to the Ecuadorian Amazon, the first thing that I learned about was oil, and and the effects that it had on real people that became my friends, lifelong friends, and people that eventually became, my wife, Nemonte. And I began doing activism. So the idea was in 2007 we began running big international campaigns to pressure the oil industry to clean up their mess. So we would work with oil company shareholders to pressure the company to fund a remediation and own up to their toxic legacy. We would work with celebrities to raise the reputational risk to the companies. We filed lawsuits, and after about 4 years of that, I realized that the real work needed to be done on the ground, on the front lines, with indigenous communities, building justice from the ground up. And so I moved to the Amazon in 2011. I asked a group of indigenous leaders that had been living downriver from the oil fields for decades, if we could start something, if we could start a project that could make a difference now, what would it be? What would you want? What would we do? And we had a discussion. Clean water, education, maybe build a health clinic, and everybody said, no, clean water. Water is life. Without water, we can't survive. And so we started a water project called Clearwater at the time, where we built rainwater catchment systems, family-sized rainwater catchment systems for indigenous communities and indigenous families affected by oil. And it was in the process of building those rainwater catchment systems across the entire Ecuadorian and also parts of Colombia and Peru, Amazon. We built over 1,200 rainwater catchment systems across 85 villages, across 5 million acres of forest. The indigenous communities of the region began working together. They began to dismantle some long-time prejudices that they had against each other. They began realizing that they were stronger together. They began realizing that they were facing common threats, and that they were each developing strategies that they needed to share with each other. And so after 3 years, and after meeting Nemonte, my wife, and she was pregnant at the time with our first daughter, with Daime, who you have seen riding around here on a bicycle and jumping on the trampoline, and we founded the Save Alliance and Amazon Frontlines. Organizations that would bring together indigenous communities across the upper Amazon, and that would begin working on strategies that went beyond clean water access. Strategies that included high-impact litigation and legal struggles. Strategies that included leveraging new technologies like satellites, drones, camera traps, GPSs, to document in real time illegal invasions into their forests, to provide evidence for our legal strategies against miners, against local governments, against the oil industry. strategies around building out territorial maps that would then serve as the basis for strategies to recover land, so to get actual land titles and permanent ownership of their territories. We also began building out strategies to recover and revitalize culture and a way of life that was under threat. As the elders in each generation passed, it's like ancient libraries passing. These are elders that are carrying thousands of years of knowledge, and it's extremely fragile, the transfer of that knowledge to the younger generations. So began work with the youth and elders on education projects, working mainly with women and youth on developing economic alternatives, and working on telling stories, working on sharing stories of indigenous peoples to create a movement around the world that can support them. So after about a decade of organizing on the front lines, raising a family on the front lines, building 2 organizations on the front lines of the Ecuadorian, Peruvian, and Colombian Amazon, we decided to write this book. And I remember when Nemonte said, it's time to write a book. It's time to tell my story. Her story. It's time to tell her story to the world. And it was because even though we had won huge legal battles protecting 500,000 acres, we had set precedent for returning indigenous land to indigenous peoples. We had built processes and adapted technologies that were working to protect millions of acres of forest. We saw that the world continued to not listen. The world continued to, with unrelenting pressure and threats on indigenous peoples. And Nemonte wanted to create opportunity to share her story, to create a bridge, so that if the world wants to continue in this reckless pursuit of profit and plunder, that they would at least have the courage to do it knowing who they're threatening, understanding and having the chance to know the cultures that they're disappearing. And so we embarked on a multi-year process of figuring out the best way to tell her story to the world. That process started deforestation, maybe soy, maybe gold mining, maybe African palm, maybe beef and cattle ranching. But in the upper Amazon, in the area that flows down from the Andes range, which is the western part of the Amazon, it's a massive, it's sitting on top of a massive reserve oil. So millions of years ago, hundreds of